He has 7.5 million Twitter followers. He leads a church of 1.2 billion Christians. Pope Francis. When Francis fever hit the U.S., Context went on location. Take a look. There aren't many 78-year-olds who keep a schedule like this. The Pope's to-do list: 4 days of diplomacy and prayer in Cuba. Fly to Washington, meet with the president, address the U.S. Congress, eat with the homeless, fly to New York, challenge the nations at the United Nations to address climate change, and then lead a prayer service for victims of terrorism at the 9/11 memorial. And before leaving New York, it's church for thousands at Madison Square Garden, and only 26 major speeches in 9 days. Our correspondent Molly Thomas was in New York to take a closer look at the Pope's impact and influence. She spoke first with Greg Funstein, a Catholic social entrepreneur. Pope Francis, Molly learned, is both popular and controversial.
Greg, I gotta ask you, why do you think this Pope is so popular?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. He was down in Washington this week, and they commented on his sort of uncanny ability to just sort of pick out individual people in the crowd and sort of address them and meet them where they are, and really enter into personal interactions with people, even by picking them out of a massive crowd. And so I think people find that they connect with him.
Truly a people's Pope.
A people's Pope. Yeah.
What has the example of Pope Francis been on your own life? I mean, in your own faith journey?
Mm-hmm. You know, it's always interesting when you see someone take long-standing traditions that everyone assumes are just things you can't really change, mm-hmm. like living in the papal palace or riding in a limousine, and just decide that they're not going to do it anymore. And it's sort of refreshing to just see someone thinking that you can rethink some of the things that are worth rethinking, and find new ways to connect and to live by example and lead by example. And I think that's been something that has been very endearing to all of us when Pope Francis did that right from the beginning. So I think he's been a great example.
Let's talk a little bit about the Chiaroscuro Foundation, one of your philanthropic endeavors, and it has a very special meaning to the name itself.
That's right. So chiaroscuro means light dark. It's an Italian word that is used in the context of art history, art technique, to refer to a contrast between light and dark, primarily in painting originally and now also in photography. We like the name because it conveys the Christian notion of light shining in the darkness, but without any specifically Christian connotation overtly. And so it inspires the way we think about how we interact with the wider world, where we're moved by our faith to do what we do, but we're willing to meet anyone wherever they are and try and communicate with them in good faith.
How does the charitable work your foundation does line up with the concerns that the Pope has been addressing, I mean, and telling the world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that struck me about some of the things the Pope said this morning at the UN, he brought these massive global concerns and issues back down to the level of the individual person, the individual family, the dignity of the person, and how he rooted the need for our respect for the environment and for ecology in the right to life of the human individual. And so that fundamental notion of personal responsibility and doing what we can in our own communities, this notion in the Catholic tradition we refer to it as subsidiarity. What we can do in our family, we do in our family, we can do in our town, and in our town. We turn to governments to solve complex problems when we need to. But this notion that we all have responsibilities in our own lives, to live within our own families, to promote peace and to promote love in our own communities, that to me is very powerful, and it aligns very much with the work that we've done over the years.
The influential Catholic writer from the Boston Globe, John Allen, writes that this Pope is not loose on doctrine, but he's really changing the way that it's applied. I mean, we see him in more of a pastoral role, more merciful than kind of maybe the harshness or the judgmental nature some people view of the church. What does that mean, though, for people who are living out an issue in their life, though, that the Catholic Church would still call sinful?
Well, the interesting thing about mercy is that there's no mercy if there's no justice, right? If there's no law, if there's no sin, why does anyone need any mercy? There's nothing to forgive, there's nothing to be sorry for. And so there's always this balance between upholding what is true about human nature and what we're all called to live in our lives as Christians and as human beings. And on the other hand, embracing people where they are in their own struggles and their own weaknesses and trying to draw them in. Pope Francis' famous comment he said, "Who am I to judge on the issue of homosexuality?" It really reminded me of when Christ was there with the woman caught in adultery, and he was writing on the ground, and he said, "He who has not sinned, let him cast the first stone." And so he wasn't saying that adultery is okay, but he was saying that we're all sinners, and we should always be merciful toward each other and embrace each other as persons and respect the dignity of others, and find a way to do it while also upholding the truth and being, as you say, not soft on doctrine. It's a delicate balance, and this Pope, I think, has struck it very well.
I mean, he's very different than the popes that we've seen before. I mean, Catholics are divided. Liberal and conservative Catholics are divided. How do you respond to that in terms of bringing the church even together?
Right. I think that it's important to note in this context that we tend to think of things the Pope says and things anyone says in the context of sort of the American political situation. The American political situation is a small part of the wide world, and the Pope is speaking. He's here in the U.S., he's obviously speaking to us now, but he's always speaking to the whole world and to the universal church. And our political categories and our political squabbles don't necessarily carry forward to other places where the issues are very different. He's talking about really universal human values, universal human goods. And so it might seem like, you read the newspapers, and it seems like they're sort of keeping score as to whose side he's on different issues. But really, he's not on anyone's side. He's on all of our sides. He's trying to promote the dignity of the human person, the right to life, and the family, and all of our responsibility within the broader context of the cosmos and the world that God created. When you believe in a creator, you believe that creation is his, and we should respect it and treat it, with respect. And so, I think that his comments transcend our political categories, and I think it's a mistake to think of them only in those terms. I think that if we listen, if anyone feels completely comfortable with everything that he says, they're probably not listening carefully, right? He's got something that should challenge all of us, I think.
The Pope's message is simplified for a lot of people, and I think that's why it's catching on. What is the message and the impression that he has left on you?
I think that by the way that he's lived and the way that he's spoken, he's calling each of us to, in our own lives, make the changes that we can make in our own sphere of influence, and not wait on governments or politics to proceed to solve these problems. By the way that he drives in a small car, by the way that he takes the bus or takes the train or walks or lives in the hotel instead of in the papal palace, I think that we can all analyze the way in which we can make changes in our own lives to promote human dignity in our communities. I think that, to me, is the fundamental message. While of course he's calling on governments to interact with each other and make the kinds of decisions and changes that need to be made and policies over time, it would be a great mistake for anyone who listens to the Pope on this trip to think, that's right, political leaders, world leaders, now what are you going to do to fix the problem? He's really calling each of us to see what we can do in our own communities and our own families to fix the problems that we face in the world.
Greg, pleasure. Thank you so much.
Pope Francis has been a pope of surprises, preferring simplicity to pomp and opulence, eating meals with the homeless, washing the feet of prisoners. His popularity stretches far beyond Catholic circles to many Protestant admirers as well. Context's Molly Thomas met with senior evangelical leaders in New York to better understand the source of his appeal.
We're here with Christine McMillan, a Director of Public Engagement with the World Evangelical Alliance. And as Pope Francis, comes to the U.S., it's not so new for you because you've actually had a chance to meet him in person. Give me an idea of what that was like.
Well, it was on his home turf at the Vatican. That adds a little different dimension than when I saw him this morning going by in his Fiat and waving to us. All the prestige, all the opulence of the Vatican. And what do you expect as you walk in? You see this ornate artwork and the history ringing out of those walls. We sit down and in he comes. And right from the beginning, he puts you at ease. And when I had the opportunity to meet and shake his hand, it was as if he looked at you as if you're the only person in the room. And you just felt that smile emanating from him as you looked back and acknowledged his presence.
Do you think that's why he is so popular? That ability to engage with people, to kind of relate on the same level that, the Catholic Church sometimes is talked about not doing well.
I think his ability to understand a humanness about every person is quite significant. I've been following his trip here in the USA, and when he stands and addresses the Congress, he acts appropriately. When you see him in a site with the poor, he's almost like a child, and his countenance changes. He is greeting people with the widest smile, and I think he's a nightmare to the security because he absolutely wants to go off limits. Mm-hmm. When he sees a child waving to him and his Pope-mobile is going by, he stops the Pope-mobile and wants to bless that child. That's where he seems to be most comfortable, but that's where he seems most exhilarated. Mm. And I think we know something about that. When we think about the person of Jesus, he found himself with the marginalized, with those who were unimportant in the scheme of the world in which he walked.
Christine, thank you. Pleasure. I'm here with Bishop Ephraim from the World Evangelical Alliance, and Bishop, you had a wonderful opportunity today. You were down at the 9/11 Memorial with leaders from different faith communities. Of course, Pope Francis, the highlighted guest. What was the significance standing there with the different leaders from different backgrounds?
Well, the gathering is about prayer for peace in relation to not only for the city of New York, but and the United States and the world in general. And so what was significant there is religious leaders have gathered from different backgrounds. This is an opportunity for different religions to come together for a common good. You know, we still maintain our distinctiveness and our own sets of beliefs. We are not trying to form a one world religion, but it's more of different religions respecting one another and addressing a common good that we have. And this time, that common good is to live with respect and to live in peaceful relationship one with another.
Bishop, you talked a little bit about cooperation there. Where are some of those collaborations that you've seen during your time?
I can speak from my experience back in the Philippines because I was leading the Evangelical Alliance in the Philippines for about 22 years. And we have had many collaboration with not only with the Catholic Church but with other faith-based groups on several issues like addressing the adverse effects of climate change, the Philippines being the first country that was affected by the typhoons, and therefore addressing the issue of climate change. From the moral issue, we address that. We address the issue of poverty alleviation. How then, as in fact, here in United Nations, the other day I spoke at the joint gathering of sponsored by the United Nations and the World Bank, gathering the faith-based groups on having the moral imperative in ending poverty as well as addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. And therefore, different faith-based groups can come together addressing the issue of how to address poverty alleviation. We also have worked on the issue of peace process because peace and justice issue is not a monopoly of one group. It is a common issue that we need to address, and we work together. So I think we all want to say that as religious leaders, we want to say we relate with other groups, we relate with other leaders in order that we can say we are neighbors, and as neighbors addressing a common agenda, a common problem in the community, then we want to have a collective response and collaborative effort in responding to many of these problems, social problems that we face in our communities.
Coming up, the radical edge of Pope Francis. Pope Francis is popular, but he is also controversial. After landing in the U.S., he made not only headlines, but waves, and that is nothing new for him. After all, this is a pope who is calling people to a new relationship with God and environmental responsibility, all in the name of God. He's written, "I'm aware that some people strongly refute the idea of a creator on political or intellectual grounds, or consider it irrelevant. However, science and religion, which offer different approaches to reality, can enter into an intense and productive dialogue with each other. To discover more about what Pope Francis is teaching us about God and the environment, Molly Thomas spoke with Dr. Stephen Sharper, Professor of Environmental Studies at the University of Toronto.
I am most grateful for
Was there
the
anything
invitation.
about the Pope's speech that really surprised you, either at the UN or at Congress?
One thing that surprised me was his emphasis on the examination of conscience, and that this is a profound moment for an examination of conscience. And the second thing that surprised me, particularly when he was talking about the environment, was the intrinsic value of nature. This is a very radical statement, and biologists and environmental scientists have been talking about this along with deep ecologists for about 40 years. But to my knowledge, this is one of the first papal statements on the intrinsic rather than instrumental value of nature, in a sense that nature has a goodness in and of itself, aside from the human use of it. And he ties that into a concern for the poor and for creation at large. So those were little accents that were interesting and surprising, that he was calling the world community to a collective, profound examination of conscience in light of climate change, global poverty, immigration and refugee crises, and the kind of collective suffering of the earth.
You've studied his writings, you've studied his recent encyclical. What do you think was his main challenge? What is his main challenge within it all?
Part of it is a new way of looking at the world. In a sense, for this Pope, as he says, nothing is indifferent to us. In business, you know, we have this term externalities. So you're making a product you're going to pollute, but the pollution is an externality. It doesn't figure into your cost-benefit analysis. For this Pope, there are no externalities. There is no away. There is no collateral damage that's acceptable. That he is trying to get us to think differently about creation, about the intersection of human beings, the natural world, and God's love for the human and earth community. It's a seamless garment approach to interconnection. And it cuts through a mindset that objectifies nature or diminishes the poor. For him, this is unacceptable and unchristian. So I think this is his greatest challenge, to help us move into a mindset of love. And I find it so interesting, not only that he took the name Francis after St. Francis, but in the introduction to Laudato Si, Praise Be, he talks about St. Francis as an exemplar. And St. Francis doesn't fit easily in our modern categories, in our categories of left or right, in our categories of economic theory. It's this loving, sibling relationship with brother sun, sister moon, brother wolf, etc. And the Pope talks about sister earth.
Pope Francis came out loving, for sure, but he also came out swinging. He said, we live in a widespread culture of waste.
Yeah.
Is that too harsh, and what is that going to achieve?
Well, it is searing, no doubt. But as you point out, he does this in a loving way. It's not the finger pointing of an earlier generation of Christian leaders that made people feel guilty. It's not a sanctimonious, holier than thou approach. He says, pray for me, I need help. And he basically expands our geography of care. So when he goes to Washington, after he speaks to the joint session of Congress, does he stay in the hallways with the powerful? No. He goes out and has lunch with people who are homeless and mentally challenged. When he goes to Philadelphia, he doesn't simply stay in the regal confines of political or ecclesial power. He visits a prison. And I think he does this not only because it's an example of the corporal works of mercy that all Christians are called to. I think he does this for his own spirituality. He needs to do this. In a sense, he does not want to be lost himself as Pope. He does not want to lose his own bearings. And he does this out of authentic, I think, concern for the poor, but also for his own spirituality. And he's modeling that you cannot simply talk about these issues and not be engaged with people who are suffering. And so he has a street credibility when he talks about this. Consequently, people can listen. It's hard to critique someone who does not appear to be a hypocrite at this international level. So when he does challenge people, it's with this loving, overarching, interconnected embrace.
Similar to Jesus.
I think this is his model, along with St. Francis, that he wants to be in love with creation. He sees the connection between the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, and he uses that term in Laudato Si, building on Leonardo Boff of Latin America. And he also sees that there's joy and awe and wonder, that this is not all hair shirts, sackcloth, and ashes, that this is an invitation to a new relationship with each other and with the earth. And he even talks about falling in love and compares St. Francis's love of creation with falling in love with another person. What the Pope is doing, I think, is asking us to fall in love again with creation and with each other, and not look at people in categories of unwanted immigrant or refugees simply trying to economically benefit themselves, but as people. And we're all people, and we are called to love each other. In many ways, it's a simple message, but he's also very politically savvy.
What does Pope Francis's message mean for your lifestyle, my lifestyle, people living in Western countries like Canada?
I think for many people, seeing the Pope in the United States was a spiritual experience. And what he was saying was, if I have to, as a pontiff, go and visit the poor, visit the homeless, visit the prisoners, for my spiritual well-being, come join me. In a sense, I can be here on the world stage and talk about it and write about it. But if I do not live it, then I am not being authentic as a Christian. So I think what the Pope's message is that we have to all witness to this life. We cannot simply talk about it or write about it, and we can't simply write petitions. That we have to live this concern for the earth, for the impoverished, for the imprisoned, for those who are abused, for all the vulnerable. And this is a spiritual call. And this speaks to people outside the Catholic Church, outside the Christian world. Here is someone bearing witness to hope. And this is inspiring at a time when people cynically think there's nothing we can do, or when data around climate change is obfuscated and doubt is raised, and therefore we don't have to do anything. The Pope cuts through that like a hot knife through butter and says, no, we have to do something. We cannot ignore this. We have to deal with this diagnostic moment, and we're sick, and we need to do something fast, and particularly because of our responsibility to people without money, without means, who are at the bottom of the ladder. We are called to them first.
So is the Pope seeing something that we are not?
Yes, I think he is, and part of that comes from his background. He's the first non-European Pope. He's the first Latin American Pope, and he's the first Jesuit Pope. He's the first Pope in about 150 years, more or less, who has taken a vow of poverty as part of his original Christian vocation. If you look at Laudato Si, when one looks at the notes, so many of the quotes are from bishops' commissions from the South, from Latin America, from the Philippines, from Africa. This was his first time to the United States. His world has not been shaped by an American globalized worldview. He brings a perspective from different parts of the world, from people who have been on the underside of a consumerist lifestyle, the throwaway culture that he talks about. This was brought on the world stage in New York, Washington, and Philadelphia. But it wasn't done, as mentioned, in a scolding and dogmatic manner. It was in a humble, self-critical, but nonetheless courageous and loving manner.
Sheldon, over to you now with a question for our viewers at home.
Thanks, Lorna. Our question for you at home is this. Pope Francis is a representative of Christianity at work in the world today. Why do you think the Christian faith is so often misunderstood? That's our question for you. Give us your answers by any of the means you see on the screen. Call us at 1-800-215-4913. You can also write to us at comments@contextwithlorna.com. Join the conversation as well on Facebook and Twitter at Context TV. You talk, we listen. That's two-way television.
Coming up, my final thoughts on the Francis effect. I loved watching Molly learn from New Yorkers why the visit of Pope Francis caught the public's imagination as it did. This is the first time in my faith history that there have been so many open arms of Protestants receiving a Pope's wisdom. The Catholic writer Father Dwight Longnecker even calls Billy Graham and Pope Francis brother evangelists. Pope Francis, he says, recognizes the twofold action required for the encounter of faith. The first step is to say, I am a sinner. The second step is to acknowledge that Jesus is the living Son of God. Too often people associate the word sin and sinner with doom, gloom, darkness, guilt, and low self-esteem. However, admitting that one is a sinner is not a step into dark bondage, but a step into the light of liberation. To say, I am a sinner, is simply to admit that we don't have all the answers. And Pope Francis turns many of our hearts to God in a new way as he presents that. And I'm delighted the Pope's telling of the eternal truth about Christ is being heard across all our differences. We really are one family under God. So, what's your view of why Pope Francis connects as he does? Are we just impressed with an authority figure, or is there really something deeper? Write to us at contextwithlorna.com. For all of us, I'm Lorna Dueck. Thanks for watching. Join us next week as we explore life beyond the headlines.
Well, as Syrian refugees flocked to Europe, we saw many countries sympathize and open their doors to the most needy. But we also saw many countries tightening their borders. Our stubborn agnostic blogger Richard Handler asks, does empathy have an expiry date? Well, it's no surprise we encounter racial stereotypes every day. We'll be talking more about this in our upcoming episode, but in my own effort to shed light on the issue, I tackle black stereotypes in a video I called I'm Black, but I'm Not. I'm black, but I'm not whitewashed just because I'm well-spoken. I'm black, but I'm not fathering a child to a woman I haven't yet married. Well, a small town in Ontario was shocked last month when a recently released prisoner was accused of murdering 3 women. The public outcry brought up the question of prisoner reintegration. We asked Stacey Campbell, president of Prison Fellowship Canada, what this incident means for how we welcome former prisoners. Well, you can find all these stories on our website at contextwithlorna.com. Good things, Canada.